commercial part of that?
Yeah, we'll focus more on residential right now on this question. Oftentimes people are going to have some work done on their home or residence, and they're going to go through a series of questions. Who do they pick? What should they look for? Things of that nature.
Right. And you are a general contractor by trade?
Yeah, we're a general engineering and a general building contractor, two separate classifications, but for the most part we're talking about the B side, or the general building contractor.
And the name of your firm?
MG Constructors and Engineers.
Okay, and there's no typo in that, right?
No typo, as far as I know.
Yeah, Constructors. Tim?
Yes.
Tell us about, you're a professional engineer?
I am, yep. Licensed professional engineer.
Now, I understand we've spoken in the past about, as a professional engineer, you need to specialize in that particular industry, or that segment of the industry, the self-policing.
Yes, well, there's lots of different types of professional engineers. There's civil engineers, mechanical engineers, electrical, and on and on and on, chemical. To work in the residential housing arena, generally what I do is structural engineering, and my engineering degree is in civil engineering with an emphasis and specialty in structural. The engineering profession requires that I only do engineering within my area of expertise.
Right.
Right. So I can't just go be a software engineer or an electrical engineer, even though I have PE after my name on my business card.
Right. Okay. And I know you work closely together. For instance, if there was some water damage or a flat roofs that we have that might start to sag, you would call your brother in to redesign.
Yeah, we typically get called out by the real estate industry or homeowners or whatever to assess and evaluate the problems, structural, drainage, waterproofing related most of the time.
Sure.
And then when we have an issue that requires a significant repair, Tim will team up with us and he'll put together the drawing package and whatnot.
Okay, so we will get to that drawing package a little later in the show. But first of all, in the real estate community, one might inspect their home, and let's say if they are in the middle of a sale, whether it's there's a termite inspection, a property inspection, a roof inspection, and so on. How does a homeowner successfully choose a contractor?
That is a really good question, because if they make a mistake, then they can put themselves and others at liability. And what we see all the time is that they choose someone who's not either one, a good contractor, or two, he's not even licensed at all.
Right.
So my recommendation would that they go through a criteria of selection to pick their person.
Now, we spoke about that in the past when, in terms of being licensed, there's Tim, there's a correct way to find out if one is licensed.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's with the state?
That's with the state, right. For engineers, there's an engineers board of professional engineers and land surveyors, and you can go online, it's very easy to find, and you can find out whatever engineer that you're looking to hire, what his license is in, and whether or not he's in good standing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mark, I know you have touched on this before, that if you go on the website for the Contractors License Board, probably half have inactive license.
Inactive, suspended, they haven't paid their dues for their license or their license bond, both of which are required to be current.
Okay.
And so if you go on, you can just Google on or go through any search engine and go to the California State Contractors License Board. It'll pop up, and then there's a button that says Contractor License Check or Contractor Check. When you pull that up, it gives you you can find anybody, and you can tell immediately if they're, number one, licensed. And a lot of people don't have their license and they're doing work on a home. Right. And the rule that is required is that if there's any work over $600, it has to be done by a licensed contractor. Okay. So that means that a handyman can fix a gate or something like that, and he's well within his right to do that. But a remodel or something like that, no way.
I've noticed since I've gotten into business that handyman dollar now, it used to be $200 and then $300, and now it's up to $600. You can have a handyman work on your house. Now, is that in total? You can do the screen door?
In total, yeah.
In total.
Yeah.
Now, you touched on the bond. We have that term, well, is your contractor licensed, bonded, and insured? So what is the bonding aspect for the homeowner. What is that about?
Let's touch on two because they're both important. Number one, in order to have an active license, you have to have a contractor's license bond, and it's right on there with the Contractor State License Board. And any contractor that's going to hand you his card or give you any business information, it will have his license number on there, his classification, and typically it will allow you to immediately access their information.
Okay. And then in terms of the insurance.
Good one.
Now, who wants to tackle the
Let me
insurance
tackle it because
issue?
we're on contract law. He can cover the other type of insurance relative to engineering.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
So every contractor, this is a must in my opinion, should have his general liability insurance and name the owner as additionally insured. Most people don't know that, but when a contractor comes to work on their house, not only should they be insured, they should provide a certificate of insurance naming the owner as protected under their policy.
How does one do that? Do they call up the insurance company and said
They
fax
just
over a
request
binder?
it and it's free. And if it costs anything, it's no more than $75 for the contractor to request that certification. Most sophisticated owners that I work with today, for example, we work for a very sophisticated building owner, owns multiple buildings in and around the area. That was one of his requirements in signing our contract to move forward, was that we provide him a certificate of insurance, naming him as additionally insured under our general liability insurance policy.
Wow. And of course, that is for if one of your workers falls off a ladder.
Could be for that, it could be for anything. Basically what it's saying is that he's insured if there's anything that goes wrong on the work while we're there.
On the job site while you're there. Now, Tim, for instance, if you're doing the designs, people in your industry also have insurance.
You can, but there's no state law requiring it. So when engineers get insurance, it's typically errors and omissions insurance, which is extremely expensive. And engineers typically get that because they want to cover themselves in case they make a mistake and they get sued.
Correct.
They fall back on that insurance.
Right.
But when they're dealing with a client, particularly in residential and smaller projects, that really doesn't come up. The dollars really aren't that big. You see it much more in municipal and big public work.
I see. Okay. Now, the selection process to finding a contractor, Mark. We have the website, of course. And then I know Tim has spoken to the fact about referrals.
Yep, big time.
Voice to voice.
Yep.
And Better Business Bureau?
I like the Better Business Bureau because anybody in business who's legitimately in for the long haul, which is typically who you're going to want working on your house. Remember, you're entering into a short-term contract. It's almost like a marriage. They're in and around your house, your children if you have them, elderly, whatever. And you want somebody who's really in it for the right reasons. And there's, just like in any industries, there's some that aren't. You know, they're lesser quality, obviously. So that's a good sifting measure. It's a voluntary, you know, they have to be a member, they pay a fee. They're also, if you make a complaint, you can complain to the Better Business Bureau, and they have a completely legitimate methodology that's fact-based. It's not opinion-based for complaints and things like that. So they have a rating as well. So you can go onto there and find, you know, just about anybody you're looking for, and they're going to have a great database to start with.
Okay. Let's get into working on the property. Let's say we have decks or a deck that wraps around the building, and now due to the weather, it's 15 years old, it wasn't built well in the first place. What's the first step that a homeowner should do? Go down to the building permit?
So they've got a deck failure going on, or
deck
they've got
failure
water
going
coming
on,
in,
just
something like
a
that.
deck failure, they want to replace the deck.
They want to replace it.
Let's say replace it.
So it's a rip out, tear out the old, put in a new. What's the first step?
Yes.
Mark?
Yeah, we have that all the time. And typically, most jurisdictions, which is going to be the local county jurisdiction or your local city municipal jurisdiction, will allow you on most smaller decks that are under 30 inches off the ground or more to get a remove and replace permit that's relatively simple. It's over the counter. That's easy. However, most decks are not. They're typically higher up. They have stairs and they have railings, which are governed by code. And then you come into the part where you need to go into the engineering piece. Decks are governed by building code, and they are required to be engineered or permitted with a licensed professional engineer and or architect designing them.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
And most people don't know that, so they can get into trouble not only by hiring the wrong kind of a contractor to do it who's not licensed or whatever, but they don't get engineering on there, they don't pull a permit, and it's done incorrectly, and we see it day in, day out.
Okay, now we hear that a lot in the residential, where they just hire a contractor and no permits, no design, just starts pulling, puts on a tool belt and starts building a deck.
Yeah, so the question that I would have to that builder is, what size deck joists are you going to use? What size beam are you going to use? How about the post? How about the footings? How about the ledger? The connection of the deck to the house through a ledger. What about those bolts? How big? How many? What's the spacing of them? The answer to all those things, to do it right, takes actual engineering. It takes science. You have to know the loads and the forces, and there's a process that engineers know how to do, but builders generally don't.
And always, the homeowner typically is following the lead of the builder. That's why, again, it's really important to get a good one, because he's going to know the processes and not get them into trouble, so to speak.
So what is for instance, if one wants to add a master bedroom suite or a second story, what's the sequence of events for a homeowner? Do they get the designer first, or an architect, or a contractor, a building permit?
If you're asking me, and Mark may weigh in differently on this, but I always like to see a designer, if it's a remodel or an addition, something like that, that's not a repair. So this is new construction.
Correct.
I always like to see a plan first from a competent architect or a designer. For me, that makes all the difference in the world. Mm-hmm. I take that plan, now I can know what the seismic loads are going to be, and I can size the beams and do all the things that I can do. And probably Mark is going to agree with me on this one. Let's find out. Yeah.
I mean, you want to know what you're going to do. The issue is that here's where I say things can get pretty sticky. If you call in a designer, and Tim made the comment, you can call in a designer in residential, which is an unlicensed, really just person who's familiar with designing. They can't pull the permit typically because oftentimes it has to be stamped and signed and done by a professional engineer and or architect. So that's the first clarification. The second one is an architect, which typically licensed person in the state that they're doing the work in by the Architecture License Board, and they're going to do things exactly by the letter of code, mm-hmm. so that you can submit the drawings for permit. So that's the first piece of that.
Okay, so when you say designer and architect, what's the difference between a designer and architect?
An architect has an architect's license through the state. A designer does not, because if they did, they'd call themselves an architect.
Right.
So it's a higher level of professional achievement to be an architect as opposed to a designer.
Now, why would a designer be at a kitchen table here designing his second story, or would they?
Sure.
Okay.
In residential, designers do a lot of residential design, and they do a great job of it, some of them. Okay. It really just boils down to their experience, and have they been in
their training.
Yeah, at it long enough to know really how it goes, and they can do it.
So once would the designer ever take plans and take it to an architect, or would they just bypass that and go directly to the engineer to have it?
If it's a relatively simple project, they'll probably bypass the architect. And a homeowner would want to know about those two options, because usually a designer's fee is going to be considerably less than an architect's.
Right. In the past, it almost seems like a designer has more of a feel of the flow of where a staircase should go, or what the trends are.
I don't think so.
Not at all? Okay.
I mean, it totally depends on, like Tim said, the quality of the person, whether he's an architect or he or she is. I've seen designers that are amazingly good. Right. Designers, and I've seen architects who I would not work with again.
Terrible.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, and vice versa.
All right. Now, so the homeowner hires a designer or an architect. Mm-hmm. That's first.
For new construction, you betcha.
Adding the second story.
Yep.
And then, do they go get the permit, or should they get the contractor first?
Here's what I recommend. Number one, we as a company typically do things so that we cover cost. Because to the homeowner, their first concern is going to be, does it hit our budget?
Sure.
So that's why it's important to have a designer who's on board with them, an engineer who typically engineers to be built for the most reasonable economical price, and that's going to meet and exceed the requirements of the building jurisdiction and building code. Those two pieces are put together only by the contractor, because he's going to take what they design and price it out and then give it to the homeowner to look at. So I would suggest, and what we do is we have them working together simultaneously. And typically we police both design and the engineering part, so that when the product is finally or ready to submit for permit, we know exactly what it's going to cost to build.
That's a great way to go. And it doesn't always go that way. In fact, that's, in my opinion, kind of rare. Usually a homeowner will hire a designer or an architect. They do the complete design without consulting a builder, and lots of times without consulting an engineer. So they finish the plans and they say, okay, Mr. Builder, Mark, give me a price for this. And he comes in with a price. Well, that's way past my budget. Well, that's because we didn't talk before you asked me for the number. Let's talk during the design process, and I'll save you money.
I see. Now let's speak about permits. We have, for years throughout my real estate career, people knock the permit process. It's not worth it. I'm not going to bother with that. But that can come back to haunt them.
Oh, huge. Especially in a real estate transaction. So if somebody is going to come to a realtor and say, I need to do this, that, and the other, and the realtor says, let's fix the house up. In the past especially, it was, I would say a larger percentage of the time it wasn't done with permits, especially the smaller projects.
Absolutely.
But the problem with that is that now there's liability in doing that. And there's also problems with the jurisdiction that you do it without a permit, then you go to do work in the future on that same structure with unpermitted work. Everything that was done without a permit has to be brought up to code as part of the new work.
Oh, interesting.
And so there's real risk for any homeowner on either side, on the work side or the purchase side.
Right. Okay, I've been involved with a property like that where the electrician was brought in to upgrade the service panel. And then he said, did you notice this is wrong, this is incorrect, this wasn't done properly? And he basically said he really didn't want to do any work on the property because it was done by a shade tree
Case
mechanic.
in point. That's what we're talking about.
We had one of those today where it was an older home, in fact nearly 150 years old, that got tweaked a bit in the Loma Prieta earthquake. After that earthquake, all the homeowners in this older section of town went running out to get a contractor to make their house stronger. Well, they found some people that said they're contractors, and they went down and they threw a bunch of boards up in their basement, but really just absolutely wasted their money. They did things that will do no good at all.
In terms of earthquake.
In terms of the next one,
retrofit,
right. Yeah, they threw nails and boards on the wall, but unless you look at the entire load path, the link in the force chain from the roof to the dirt, and you got to look at every link. They looked at one link really well, but the up ones above it and below it.
Okay, that's a good point. So if one had a permit on that, the building inspector would have come out and said,
absolutely,
this is a joke.
Well,
this is
they would have
unacceptable.
required a professional engineer to do the drawings in the first place. And then they would have required a plan review process where they take the drawings in, look at them, make sure that they meet the code requirements, and then they issue the permit. And then during the course of the work, they oftentimes will have the inspector of record, which would be, or the engineer of record would come out and look at the work and require him to do what's called third-party inspections or a delegated third-party inspector.
Okay, this is exactly the point is, over the decades of my career, people knock the building permit process or inspectors, and for a few $100s or whatever the fees are, they will second guess what's going on in your property.
Yeah, the intention is that there's real value in that permit process. Now, agreed, we pull probably 10 to 20 building permits a month. So
wow.
Sometimes and certain jurisdictions have a different attitude about that.
Sure.
But our whole point is that if you're going to do something that has to be required to be permitted, which most things do, that you go through the exercise of doing it and doing it properly. It saves everybody in the long run, and you don't waste your money. And it's a case in point, the job we look at today, they spent thousands of dollars on work that had zero value. And we see that daily.
And then they at the end of it, they thought they were bulletproof for the next earthquake.
Yeah.
We'd spent all the money, it's got to be better,
If we
right?
wrote those checks, it's something. In terms of how does one, what if if there is a contractor, somebody's working on their property and they sense this is not going well? What can a homeowner do to get rid of this person? Is there a government agency to step up and say,
My general opinion is you don't want to bring the government in to clean anything up. You want to do it yourself beforehand so that you don't have the problem to begin with. And so, but if you do get into that situation, the first thing I would do is go to the top of the food chain in that contractor's organization, typically the owner, and say, hey, we've got a problem, we want this addressed. Most contractors with integrity will immediately change course and make sure that they accommodate the owner. If they do not, then typically what I would strongly suggest the owner do is have verbiage in the contract that they sign with the contractor that gives them the right to terminate the contract.
okay,
So in other words, the owner can say, hey, I want you to stop, we're going to make things right, and you're going to leave. And it should be covered in the contract. We have that clause in ours to protect us and the homeowner.
okay, let's get into that for the homeowner. So, by the way, in terms of the contracts, done that, the designer and the contractor, or the designer and the architect would have a contract.
You bet.
And then
They should. They don't
they
always.
should?
If they're worth their salt, they will have. You bet.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, now the engineer, would the contractor be, would your
The
contractor be the
engineer-
homeowner or with the architect?
It can go either way.
Okay.
I prefer to work directly for the homeowner. That way my bill does not go through anybody else to get marked up, and my fee is as efficient for them as possible.
I see.
But one thing that I want to say, expand on a little bit that Mark was talking about, especially with architects and engineers, I guess just like with builders, the due diligence is far and away the best way to make sure that you get the right team first.
Sure.
It's all about getting the right people on the bus to begin with. If you don't do that, you're just begging for trouble.
So there's a lot of people, they're school teachers or nurses or doctors, they don't deal with a lot of contractors, but before they can add that second bathroom or third bathroom, or they're going to have a series of contracts. One with the designer, one with the
Well,
engineer.
there's other ways. You can do what's called design build, and that's what MG does a lot of, so that the homeowner deals with one person,
Okay.
and then all of the professionals are under that one contract.
Okay, you stole my thunder on that.
Sorry
that
about
was
that.
Yeah, so then the homeowner can say, I'm just going to hire Mark, and Mark's going to take care of everything. Otherwise, what I described earlier is the contractor's acting as the homeowner contractor.
You can. Actually, that's a point we ought to cover, because the homeowner, there's actually a piece of legislation that allows a owner builder to do his own work. And a lot of people do that, and I encourage that if they have the time and the competency to do just that. So if a guy owns his own home, or a couple does that, and maybe one of them is home, they can take the task on themselves. The law allows it. Now here's where the rub is, though. If they hire people to work for them, which they're almost always going to hire subcontractors and or people directly, they still, meaning the California contract law, requires that they hire people and pay their workers' compensation premiums and their wages, and that they follow, and that they're insured. So even though the owner can do the work himself, he doesn't have to provide insurance for himself. But as soon as he hires somebody, bingo, the law says you got to provide workers' comp. Just like if you were hiring a contractor, that contractor that hires people has to pay workers' compensation on his workers.
So is that if the homeowner is hiring a contractor? Same thing? He has to pay?
Absolutely. And you want to make sure, because what happens if the worker gets hurt on the job, on your job, and there's no workers' compensation insurance? Most likely he's going to hire an attorney, and they're going to sue everybody involved, the contractor, the homeowner, everybody.
Now, how does a homeowner get workman's comp insurance, or how does they?
Well, if they're going to do an owner-builder exemption, which means that they don't need to have a general contractor do the job, they can do it themselves, they would go to their insurance agent and say, hey, I'm going to hire 2 carpenters, an electrician, or whatever, and I'm going to pay them a wage, and I need to have a workers' compensation premium for them.
Now, I've seen a lot of those contractors, and a lot of those contracts are just single page, I'm going to do this for this amount of money. What you spoke about earlier is that release clause, if you wanted to fire or part way, go separate directions with a contractor. Those are more detailed contracts written by attorneys. right?
Yeah, I mean mine is.
Yeah.
But typically mine, everything should fit on 1 or 2 pages.
Okay.
And I'm a little leery personally about seeing a contract that's like 5, 6 pages long.
Well, conversely, if there's just one piece of stationery and say, I'm going to do these 15
Yeah.
things, here's the bill.
Exactly.
And
it is.
there's no wording in there to fire the contract.
Well, there's no wording for anything.
Anything, exactly.
Yeah. And it's the same thing with design, right?
Absolutely. I mean, my standard contract is 1 page. And I think simpler is better, but there are some certain basic things like cost, time frame, what you're going to do. In my case, what you're not going to do. If I go to you and you've asked me to take a look at your roof system, I will say I'll look at the roof, but that's all in the existing house. So I'm not taking liability for the foundation or whatever else.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
And those clauses to go separate directions are, as you mentioned earlier, it is good for both parties to say, hey,
Yeah, it
this is
should
not
be.
working out, we should go and...
Win-win.
Right.
Yeah. Most qualified, good, reputable firms are going to have a win-win type of an attitude on everything. And that's a big part of your selection process.
Okay, in closing, they should always clean up for themselves, right?
No.
Don't leave a mess on
It's a
your way
no-brainer.
out.
If they leave it in a mess, that's not a good sign.
You will hear about it.
Yes.
Okay. Can you guys stick around, do another program?
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
let's
Oh,
do it.
yeah.
Beautiful. Okay. Thanks again for watching Kapowich on Real Estate. This is a program dedicated to consumer protection within the residential real estate arena. We will see you next week, same time, same channel. Thanks for watching.